As of 1840, the Jewish population in America was at about 15,000. After the assassination of Alexander II in 1881, there were riots against the Jewish community in southern Russia. In a book review published in 2005 at Edvard Radzinsky's Alexander II, The Last Great Tsar, the reviewer writes, "It's difficult to reform Russia, as popular historian Radzinsky shows in this lively examination of the Tsar, best known for emancipating the serfs in 1861. Viewed as the most liberal of Russia's 19th century Tsar, Alexander II, 1818 to 1881, came to power in 1856 with the idea of bringing Russia into the modern age. Under the new Tsar, laws known as May laws were put into place, preventing Jews from living in any area with fewer than 10,000 inhabitants. Many other rights were taken away from the Jewish people, for example, the right to secondary education or going to a hospital in a different village. These riots led to a large emigration of Jews from Russia. More than 90% of these Jews immigrated to the U.S. Mary Anton describes her experience being Jewish in Russia in her book, Promised Land. "I remember a time when I thought a pogrom had broken out in our street, and I wondered that I did not die of fear. It was some Christian holiday, and we had been warned by the police to keep indoors. Gates were locked, shutters were barred. Fearful and yet curious, we looked through the cracks in the shutters. We saw a procession of peasants and townspeople, led by priests, carrying crosses and banners and images. We lived in fear till the end of the day, knowing that the least disturbance might start a riot, and a riot led to a pogrom." In Eastern Europe, the United States was referred to as the Golden Land. Jewish people dreamed of leaving anti-Semitism and coming to America, where they wanted to believe the streets were paved with gold. Leaving Russia was a difficult and expensive task. The cost of legally leaving was very expensive, so people resorted to illegal immigration. A ticket would usually cost between $12 and $35. This was over a year's income for most Jewish people. In his memoir, A Dreamer's Journey, philosopher Morris Raphael Cohen spoke of his voyage. "We were huddled together in the steerage, literally like cattle, my mother, my sister, and I, sleeping in the middle tier, people being above us and below us, as well as on the same level. Naturally, we could not eat the food of the ship, since it was not kosher. We only asked for hot water, into which my mother used to put a little brandy and sugar to give it taste. Towards the end of the trip, when our bread was beginning to give out, we applied to the ship's steward for bread, but the kind he gave us was unbearably soggy." Passengers were relieved when they finally reached their destination. Novelist Anzia Yezierska recalls her reaction when she saw America. "Land, land," came the joyous shout. "America! We are in America!" cried my mother, almost smothering us in her rapture. All crowded and pushed on deck. They strained and stretched out to get the first glimpse of the golden country, lifting their children onto their shoulders so that they might see beyond them. Men fell on their knees to pray, women hugged their babies and wept, children danced, strangers embraced and kissed like old friends in love. Age-old visions sang themselves to me, songs of freedom of an oppressed people. America, America. It is estimated that over 2/3 of the new Jewish immigrants settled in New York, Chicago, Boston, and Pennsylvania. My ancestor, Solomon Cohen, came from Russia in 1888. He was one of the many Russian immigrants to settle in the Lower East Side of New York. He began work as a tailor and later became a merchant. Many Jewish immigrants worked as tailors in America. They were considered unskilled workers. Even after immigrants had escaped hardships of life in the old country, the living conditions were still undesirable in America. Alan Foreman describes the tenement buildings in the Jewish quarter of the Lower East Side of New York in a magazine article in The American Magazine, 1888. They are great prison-like structures of brick, with narrow doors and windows, cramped passages, and steep, rickety stairs. In case of fire, they would be death traps, for it would be impossible for the occupants of the crowded rooms to escape by the narrow stairways, and the flimsy fire escapes so laden with broken furniture, bales, and boxes that they would be worse than useless. In the hot summer months, these fire escape balconies are used as sleeping rooms by the poor wretches who are fortunate enough to have windows opening upon them. In his book, At the Edge of a Dream, the story of Jewish immigrants on New York's Lower East Side, 1880 to 1920, Lawrence Jeffrey Epstein says of the Lower East Side, "The Jewish immigrants who fled Eastern Europe found refuge there as they learned English and discovered in their golden new land a place of unparalleled freedom and opportunity. But the Lower East Side was also a place of grinding poverty, unendurable sweatshops, vicious crime, and tiny, vermin-infested tenement flats." Immigrants leaving anti-Semitism back home still faced it in America. In Atlanta, Georgia, in 1915, Leo Frank, a native New Yorker, was accused of murdering a 13-year-old employee. Frank was a prominent member of his community and a member of a Reform temple. He faced anti-Semitism in his trial, and even with little evidence, Frank was sentenced to life in prison. Frank was kidnapped from prison and lynched by a mob. His murder terrified Jewish Americans. After Frank's murder, the Ku Klux Klan gathered outside of Atlanta and burned a cross. They targeted Jews, blacks, and Catholics. The Klan gathered 4 million members in less than a decade. This group outnumbered all of the Jews in the United States. One of the most powerful men in the country, Henry Ford, published his anti-Semitic views in the Dearborn Independent, a newspaper in Michigan, in 1920. He said that the Jews were bent on ruling the world. In his book, Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler praised Henry Ford. With such an influential person spreading lies about the Jewish people, many caught on to the anti-Semitic craze. Jews were denied services and jobs due to widespread anti-Semitism. The U.S. Constitution states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This was important to the Jewish people because it gave them the freedom to worship without prosecution. However, for a time, states had the right to prohibit Jews from voting or holding public office. In 1826, Maryland passed a Jew bill that gave Jews their full rights. Through the difficulties they faced, many Jewish people thrived in America. In 1888, a Russian immigrant family opened Katz's Delicatessen in Lower East Side. Katz's recreated the taste and feel of home for many immigrants. The deli is still open, famous and thriving in New York. The Yiddish theater was an important part of Jewish culture. It was easily relatable to personal struggle and gave people a chance to hear their own language. Yiddish is a mixture of German and Hebrew. Eventually, Yiddish was spoken less and less and has begun to phase out. In the 1930s, the Jewish people living in America became fearful due to the rise of the Nazi Party. In 1933, a rally was held in New York to bring attention to the current issue in Germany. The Jewish people of America looked to their president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He kept his focus on the war with the idea that the only way to stop the murderers was by taking care of the murderers. Roosevelt used the phrase, "rescue through victory," to describe this. After the war, when images of the Holocaust were released, words could not describe the horror of the Jewish Americans. Because of this, many Jews refused to visit Germany. The horrors of World War II led to a decline in anti-Semitism in America. During their time of grief, it was nice for the Jewish Americans to feel acceptance. Every time a new wave of immigrants came to America, they instantly plummeted to the bottom of the social and economic hierarchy. For the Jewish people, although they were not forced to immigrate, it was necessary in order to obtain the resources and political freedom that they were denied in their home country. With thoughts of arriving to a life of prosperity, new immigrants were faced with the reality that there were still challenges ahead. Poverty and anti-Semitism were obstacles that had to be overcome before prosperity was possible.